be great. Okay, so the second session that we're going to look at is decentralized clinical trials. This is a buzz phrase that everybody's talking about, and I know a lot of people don't like this term because they find it a bit confusing. And decentralized, all clinical trials are decentralized because unless they're single center, I mean, I guess a phase 1 you would say wasn't decentralized, but most clinical trials have got, you know, lots of different sites and lots of different patients involved. So to one extent, they're all decentralized, but what people usually mean by decentralized is where you're using remote capabilities. So you're not necessarily doing things in person. So I've got this quote from a document I'm going to talk about in a minute, which is the EMA's recommendation paper on decentralized elements in clinical trials. And what they're saying is clinical trials on investigational medicinal products are increasingly using procedures conducted outside the traditional clinical trial site, a concept usually referred to as decentralization. So we're really talking about the situation where the patients are not visiting the investigational site, so or not visiting as often, and therefore some of the activities for the trial are done remotely. And there are different ways of doing that. So it could be done electronically over the internet, or it could be that you're sending somebody to the patient's home to do assessments or provide IMP or that kind of thing. So it could be still in person, but done remotely, or it could be electronic. And I think both of those are definitely happening more. And the whole area of decentralized clinical trials really kind of accelerated during COVID. So just to start with a little bit of background, I just want to talk about some of the things that happened during COVID, and then we can look at what the regulators are kind of thinking now post. And I know COVID hasn't gone away completely, but most of the restrictions around COVID have gone. So we're kind of back to business as usual to some degree. So, you know, the guidance post-COVID is kind of beginning to come out now. So what happened during COVID? Most of the guidance, most of the regulators produced new guidance for trials that were ongoing during COVID. So FDA, EMA, MHRA, the Health Research Authority in the UK and lots of other countries produced guidance for the global pandemic situation. So I just want to summarize some of the key things that kind of are relevant for decentralized clinical trials from the guidance that they produced. So in terms of the common themes, it was recognized that there would be an increase in protocol and SOP deviations. So they needed to be documented with a COVID-19 tag, but what the MHRA said was that they wouldn't be a serious breach unless patients were put at risk. So, you know, it might be that we couldn't do some patient assessments. It might be that patients weren't visiting the sites. We weren't doing monitoring visits in the same way that we were. So as long as patients are not being put at risk by those changes, then it wasn't considered a serious breach. What they wanted us to do, though, was to look at the alternative procedures and do a risk assessment and look at how that impacted on the clinical trial. So, for example, remote monitoring, you know, what's the impact on the patients, on the data? And also what they didn't want us to do was to increase the burden to site staff. Because if you're going to do remote monitoring, then the site staff, you know, some people were asking site staff to provide printouts of information or copies of information or sit on the end of a call to do source data verification, which obviously makes life a lot more difficult. So whatever we're doing, we shouldn't be increasing the burden to site staff. But one of the things that all the regulators made clear was that prospective protocol waivers were and still are unacceptable. So if you're going to deviate, it's got to be in response to something rather than kind of planning it up front. So protocol waivers are not acceptable still. So that was kind of a summary, but there were some key areas where guidance was produced and things changed. So in terms of trial management, there might have been a need to slow or halt recruitment. And they said that if the temporary halt was due to COVID, then it wasn't an urgent safety measure unless patient safety was affected. But obviously now that would be the case if there was a temporary halt. And then restart didn't require approval unless the protocol changed significantly. Again, post-COVID, that's not going to be the case. So we shouldn't be using that now. It was just in response to the situation. But this might be something where in future we need to think about the risk of this happening again and potential proactive risk mitigation strategies. So that was one thing. In terms of the patients, obviously a lot of patients either couldn't or didn't want to visit the hospital. So a lot of visits were either done remotely or were postponed or were completely cancelled. So we needed to think about how we did that and what the impact of the patients on the patients was. There was also the possibility to transfer patients to other sites or to local sites. So, recruiting local GPs or labs to do some of those assessments. And also to conduct critical lab tests locally. And again, those would be options now as well, to have phone visits, video visits. And one of the things that I found with some of my clients at this point was that it really forced them to look at their protocol and say, what is critical? So it's about these critical to quality factors. What is critical for us to reach our endpoints? And they were able to say, well, some of the visits aren't necessary, some of the assessments aren't necessary. So we should be thinking about that for future protocols and simplifying our protocols and not collecting information that we don't need. And also using local labs to do tests or sending nurses out to do blood samples or assessments rather than having patients coming in to the sites. So that happened as well. In terms of consent, there was a whole kind of issue around the fact that things were changing and therefore we might need to reconsent patients. And that then brought in the idea of remote consent, which is something that we've kind of been developing for a little while anyway. And FDA have issued guidance on electronic consent, including remote consent. And I think EMA have also now done some guidance on that as well. Oh no, it's not EMA, it's the EFGCP, I think. European Forum for GCP have produced some support documentation on this. So the option was introduced to have oral consent remotely over the phone, and then confirming via email and via signing the form next time they were in. And e-consent was only allowed at that point if it was already in place. But it is something that is increasingly an option, is to do remote e-consent. There are obviously issues with that, and there's a lot of additional considerations around, how do you know it's the patient? How do you know they're not being coerced? How do you know they've read the information? All of that kind of stuff, which you've got to consider when you do e-consent. Changes to provisions of IMP. This was another thing that came in. There were kind of emergency mitigations to allow IMP to be transferred between sites or to go to local new sites. So, maybe identifying a pharmacy near to where the patient lived where you could send the IMP, or even sending the IMP directly to the patients, either from the site or from the sponsor. Now, that's only allowed in some countries. It is allowed in the UK. And I'm going to talk to you about new guidance which will help with this, because the EMA have produced guidance on the differences in different countries for this, because some countries will allow delivery direct to patients' homes and some won't. But again, this is an option for the future. And my daughter for a while was working for a company that provides nursing services to clinical trials. So the nurses go to the patients' homes, and they also delivered the IMP to the patients' homes. So I know from her experience that there are a lot of issues with this, but it is feasible. It is something that we can do as long as you've got the right provisions in place. So IMP provision direct to patients' homes is an option. I mean, obviously not for every product, it depends on the product, but for things that the patients can manage themselves, or where you could have a nurse go out and help them, that is an option. And then the final bit was about monitoring. So either reducing the amount of monitoring or doing remote or centralized monitoring. My understanding, or how I describe the difference between remote versus centralized monitoring. Remote monitoring is where the monitor is not at the site, but they're still communicating one-to-one with the site. So they might be communicating via email and Zoom or Teams and telephone, that kind of thing. So they're still communicating one-to-one with the site, but they're not physically present at the site. I describe that as remote monitoring. And then centralized monitoring is where you're not focused on one site, you're looking at all of the information together. So all of the data from all of the sites is being reviewed centrally, so that you can see trends, you can see differences between sites, you can see anomalies and outliers, that kind of thing. So centralized monitoring is where you're looking at all of the information across the whole trial in one place. And remote monitoring is where a monitor is sitting outside of the site, but communicating directly with the site. And again, both of those are options in a decentralized kind of setting. MHRA said that email could replace wet ink signatures for the purposes of the COVID pandemic. Again, you'd need to have checks and balances in place to make sure that the email worked, and obviously you can have e-signatures now, and we're using that a lot more, but it's slightly more difficult with patients, I think. Some countries may also allow remote access to source documents. So the EMA is not keen on remote access to source documents, but there are various countries in Europe where you are allowed to do it. So, and again, this list that I'm going to tell you about, the EMA has provided guidance on what the requirements are in each country. So some countries will allow it and some countries won't. The UK will allow it. The MHRA recently provided guidance on electronic source documents and sponsor access, both on-site and remote. And also FDA have provided guidance on remote monitoring as well. I can see there's a comment in the chat. Risk-based monitoring is a centralized and remote monitoring together, right? It's actually all three types of monitoring. A risk-based approach to monitoring basically just means that you assess the risks and then you write a monitoring plan that addresses those risks. So I think a proper risk-based monitoring plan could well include on-site monitoring, remote monitoring, and centralized monitoring, but just used in different proportions depending on the risks. If you've got a very high risk trial, you might want to do all on-site monitoring. If you've got a very low risk trial, you might want to do all decentralized monitoring. But a true risk-based monitoring plan takes all of the risks into account and then writes a plan that meets those risks in whatever way is most appropriate. And I still get people saying, oh, we don't do risk-based monitoring, we do 100% of everything. It's still risk-based monitoring. You've just decided that the risks mean that you want to do 100% of everything. So yeah, it's so it can include all three. And then the final thing about this was that when you had to reduce the monitoring because of COVID, EMA wanted a robust plan to bridge those gaps. So if there were going to be any issues or things that needed sorting out at the end, they wanted a plan as to how that was going to be done. Okay, so that's kind of what happened during COVID. And all of those guidances are still available from the regulators. But obviously, we're now kind of moving on, and a lot of those things that suddenly became an option or suddenly became required during COVID, we can now pull those into future clinical trials. So there's a lot of discussion around this, and there's every conference you go to, they'll be talking about decentralized clinical trials. But I just wanted, before I hand over to you again, to go through the current guidance that's out there. So in terms of the EU, there is what they call the ACT EU initiative, which is called Accelerating Clinical Trials. So this is an EU EMA initiative. So it's the European Heads of Medicines Agencies. They've launched this initiative, and they've got a subgroup of this ACT EU that is specifically looking at decentralized clinical trials. So what they have done is produce a recommendation paper, and this just came out fairly recently, just in the last month or so. So what it covers is the kind of specific aspects when you're running a trial which has decentralized elements in it, the kind of specific things that you need to think about in terms of running that clinical trial. So oversight, roles and responsibilities, how are you demonstrating oversight and who does what? Informed consent, and again, things about e-consent and remote consent. IMP, delivery and administration of IMP at the patient's homes, issues around that. Conducting study procedures at home, so blood samples, blood pressure measurements. There's lots of things that you could do in the patient's home, or in a local, like a GP setting or a pharmacy setting. Data collection and management, including source data verification. So again, that's using remote data entry, patient reported outcomes and ePro devices, and also the whole source data verification thing, and remote potential for remote source data verification. And then there's also a chapter on monitoring, and the different types of monitoring and how you perform monitoring remotely, and how you do put your monitoring plan together. So that's the kind of there's guidance on each of those areas in the guidance document, and then there's an appendix which gives you the summary of the legal situation in each country. So the two main things that I think are really helpful in that are, can you deliver IMP to patients' homes? Because some countries won't allow it, some will. And also the remote access to source data. And again, some countries will allow it and some countries won't. And I found that list very interesting, actually. But it does help if you're thinking about doing this in a multinational clinical trial. You can see which countries it will be easier and which ones will make it harder. So again, I'll give you a link for that when we send out the handout later on. So that's the EMA's recommendation paper. And then the MHRA, they're also talking about this quite a lot. It came up quite a bit in the GCP symposium last year. But they've issued guidances, as I mentioned, sponsor access to electronic health records, that's one, and that includes issues around remote access. There's one about oversight and monitoring of clinical trials. And there's also the MHRA and the HRA, so the Health Research Authority, which looks after ethics committees. They've issued a joint statement on e-consent, because obviously ethics do focus very much on consent. So again, I'll give you links for all of those documents. You can have a look at those.